Hey there, I'm Shane. Today I'm going to be talking about astrophotography and taking videos and images of the night sky and how to make time lapses with star trails. In this video, I'm going to cover the basics, the equipment that you'll need, all the different preparation I like to make before actually going out into the field to capture the time lapse. And then I'm going to show you actually me going into the field and capturing a time lapse, and also how I like to edit it when I get back home on my computer. Star photography has always been a fascination of mine. Ever since I started taking pictures, it's been mesmerizing to see the way the stars kind of paint their way across the night sky and light up the landscapes that you take. It's something that you can't really ever see with your naked eye unless you're in the perfect environment. When I first started though, I really thought that it was such an unattainable goal to be able to get these images and videos. However, it's not terribly complicated. But I did make 2 other videos before this one explaining kind of the basics on how to get started. So I really recommend you check out those videos first. I'll put a link to the playlist both in the top corner, one of these here now, and also in the description. And in those videos I talk about long exposures and time lapses. And really this takes both of those 2 concepts and kind of pushes them to the farthest degree of what your camera can do. So I'm not saying you can't just jump into this video and I'll cover all the basics, but I really recommend you get comfortable with getting these long exposure photos during the day so that when it's dark at night and it's cold and you're out there maybe for an hour or 2, you're not like getting frustrated because you just aren't as fluent with the settings yet. So I recommend maybe trying that first and then diving into this. But anyways, let's get started. Before you do anything else, the first thing you're gonna need is a tripod. And really, I recommend maybe a metal tripod or something that's a little bit heavier because you're gonna be outside for a while most likely, and especially in the cold. I know metal gets hard, but if it's very cold, plastic can crack. So you really want a heavy, well-built tripod that can kind of stand to the elements. An awesome feature on most tripods is also a hook at the bottom where you can maybe drop a bag. This is an easy way to add a bit of weight to your tripod and really get that extra stability that you'll need for these really long exposure photos over an extended period of time, so your camera doesn't shift at all. The next thing you're gonna need is, of course, a camera. And it doesn't need to be a fancy camera. However, it does help to have a camera that can shoot well in low light situations. I use Sony cameras, specifically the Sony a7R III, and that camera is like pretty darn good in low light. But like when I started, I was using the Sony NEX3N, I think, for my first nighttime photo, and I did get the stars in it. And you can use APS-C and micro four thirds sensors. It's just a little bit more complicated because you can't push the image as far usually due to the smaller sensor size and the lower ISO sensitivity. However, moving forward into the future, as cameras get better and better and smaller sensors get better, this is not going to be the case. But right now, it still is generally a little bit better to have a larger sensor and higher low light performance. So just keep that in mind. The other thing you're gonna need is a pretty decent wide angle lens. The reason I say this is because the wider the angle of the lens, the longer the exposure you can take. I'll explain this later in the video. The other important component of your lens is to have it be very fast. By this I mean is that the aperture can be very low. So I use an f2.8 lens. You can use an f1.8 lens, but generally those are less wide angle. So you kind of have to change your settings accordingly with that. But really, when I started, I was using like an f4 crop sensor lens, and you can still get the photos, but it's just, you'll get better performance out of a better lens. So that's just one thing to keep in mind when you're picking the right lens to use. But thankfully, that's really it. The other thing I really recommend that you take with you is a flashlight, because it's gonna be really dark and you're gonna need to see your camera and also just see where you're walking. So A good flashlight is always important. And another real nice perk is hand warmers. Not only for just your hands and your feet maybe, but also your camera, because condensation can form on the front lens element of your camera. And if you just slap an elastic band with a hand warmer to it, your camera lens will not cool down as quickly and condensation won't form on it. So it's a good way to prevent condensation on your front element. I'll move on next to planning. And planning is almost more important for star photos than actually going out into the field and getting them. Sometimes you can just see a nice night sky and you have the kit with you to capture it, and that's awesome. But if you're intentionally going out to get these photos, for some reason it's almost impossible sometimes, because either the weather doesn't cooperate, or it's just a bad night and it's too cold, or just a lot of factors can play into it. So the more prepared you are, the more successful you'll be. So starting off is picking the right location. In terms of picking the right foreground, it's completely up to your taste. I like using maybe a river or a lake as something in my midground, so you can get a bit of a reflection from the stars on that lake and get a bit of movement in the water. Or you can just be in a forest or even just in a desert. I've never gotten to go to a desert before, but I've seen photos from them and they seem pretty cool. But the most important thing is being in a location without light pollution. Light pollution is incredibly common these days. With more and more people everywhere, there's more light. And there's a lot of good resources out there to help direct you to where there is safe zones for less light pollution. I'll include a link to this website called lightpollutionmap.info. And basically this is just a website that collects a whole lot of data and shows you areas where there's less light pollution. But generally speaking, the farther away from the city you are, the more successful you'll be. When I'm here in Ontario, one of my favorite places to go is Tobermory, which is just up the Bruce Peninsula. And over there, it's beautiful night skies. Almost every night there's no clouds and you can see the Milky Way. So it's a great place if you're local to where I am. And it's not a bad drive, and there's tons of hotels and campsites up there. The next tricky part is knowing what's going to be in the night sky. And the first part of this is knowing where the moon is. This is a pretty easy thing to figure out because there's something called a lunar calendar. And I just have an app on my phone that updates me every time there's a new moon. So I can actually go out and just see the sky without any moon in it. It's also really handy just because you can see when the moon sets. Because once the moon sets in the sky, the stars are going to be a whole lot more clear. And if there's any clouds in the sky, they won't be lit up by the reflection from the moon. And even more importantly, your foreground will be significantly less lit up. Because when you're taking a 10, 15-second photo or even a 30-second photo, your foreground can almost be overexposed because of the moon if it's very bright. So it's an important thing to keep in mind of where the moon is at. The next thing is going to be the weather, and most importantly, how many clouds are in the sky. If it's going to be an overcast night, it's going to make it a whole lot more difficult to get your images of the stars because there's going to be clouds streaking across your image. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, and you can definitely work around it, and you can get some cool images of the night sky with the clouds in the composition. However, they can be distracting, and kind of my favorite images I've gotten have been on clear nights. All you have to do is just look at the forecast though for this one. The last thing you're going to want to keep in mind is where the stars are, and more importantly, where the Milky Way is. So when you're in the southern hemisphere, you're kind of out of luck, but up in the northern hemisphere, we conveniently have Polaris, or the North Star, which you can just basically point your camera at and you're good to go because all the stars will revolve around that point. In the southern hemisphere, there are apps for it. I use an app called Star Walk 2, which basically just gives me a good image of how the sky is going to be moving during the night, and I find that really helpful. But really just look up Star app in whatever phone you have's app store, and there's a lot of good apps out there that all kind of do the general same idea of just show you where the stars are and where the constellations are, and it helps you kind of pick where to point your camera. So now we're going to move on to choosing your settings, and I hate to beat a dead horse here, But if you haven't seen my previous videos, I really recommend you checking those videos out. In my first video, I talked about kind of the basics of long exposures in the settings you'll want and how to hone in your settings with that. And also in my time-lapse video, I cover how to use the intervalometer in a more relaxed environment than this one, and I just dedicate more time to the subjects. So if you want, you can check those videos out. But anyways, I'll continue on with this video. So really, all long exposure photos at night is kind of pushing your camera as far as you can go. So what I mean by this is you're going to be getting basically the best image you can get with the best settings you can get. So you're going to want to put your shutter speed as long as you can go without getting star trails on your stars, because you still want nice crisp stars. So I'll talk about like how to calculate your shutter speed in a second. But the next thing you're going to want to do is kind of like pick the ISO that you need to use in order to get there. Your aperture is almost always going to be as low as you can go because you want to let in as much light as you can, unless you're trying to get a sharper image or something. But I usually have wide open just so I can get as much light in. Another thing that's very useful is setting the white balance yourself. This is important because from photo to photo in a time lapse, or even just a long exposure at night, it can be difficult for your camera to pick the white balance itself, just because it's nighttime and it's not really getting a whole lot of data to pick it. So if you choose your own white balance, it's going to increase the consistency of the images it captures. For star photos, there's a rule called the 500 rule. And basically all this is 500 divided by your focal length and your aperture. So it's more from the film era that this rule was developed in early DSLRs, and it didn't translate as well over to like really high megapixel cameras or even just like 24 megapixel cameras. It's not really as relevant anymore. But the idea is though, as you get these longer exposures, you're going to get little trails on your stars because you're going to move across the sky while you're taking your image. For this reason, having a wide-angle lens is more beneficial because relatively to your camera, the stars are moving a shorter distance in the sky. By doing this, you can get a longer exposure image because the stars will be moving less in that image. I find that the Lonely Spec does a lot better job explaining this than myself, and go check out their website where they have a calculator actually to kind of give you an idea of what the correct shutter speed to use will be and even your ISO. So I have a link in the description to the lonelyspec.com and their calculator there. But the thing to keep in mind is the 500 rule, again, is applied to like 8 megapixel pictures. Not 42 megapixel pictures. So when you print them off, you will see a bit of star trail in them if you're printing them at like the max resolution. For Instagram though, 8 megapixels is fine and it doesn't matter as much. So you kind of have to pick your settings based on what kind of specific parameters you care about most and what's more important to you, like if you're trying to print these or if you're trying to make a video from these. Different things will become more important in your settings, but just the 500 rule is a great way to kind of get an idea of where you should start with your settings and kind of refine your image from there. So that's a lot of information, and I apologize for that, but it's all really important to kind of have all this stuff planned before you head out into the field. Where I'm gonna go now, it's gonna be really dark and it's probably gonna be pretty entertaining, but I'm gonna try and be as informational as possible. Hey there, so here we are now at Lions Head Provincial Park in Ontario. This is an awesome location for nighttime photography as it's actually a protected dark sky zone in Ontario, and is actually one of the darkest areas you can get to in southern Ontario. So that's awesome. I've been here a couple times where I went farther up to Tobermory, and you probably saw a couple photos from there earlier in the video. But I know this location is awesome. However, I said earlier in the video, you want to head out when the conditions are ideal. That is being clear skies and no moon. Today, the skies are not perfectly clear. However, most of the clouds are clearing up now. However, the moon is going to be coming up shortly, so it's not going to be ideal for photos. However, it will work just for setting an example in this video. So I'll make the best of it. It's unfortunate that it's not perfect today though. But moving forward, a key thing you want to keep in mind when picking a location is that you head there before you actually want to take the photos. Heading there in the middle of the night is going to be very difficult, just to get to a spot. Here we are actually probably a good 100 to 150 meters above the actual lake level, and we're on a cliff, which is super dangerous. But I have a friend here with me and we have flashlights and everything, and we've actually been here for a good 3 hours now from before sunset, just so we know the location and we can set up a composition. This way, we're not going in blind and we're being as safe as we possibly can. But now that we actually have the location decided and the composition set up, you're going to want to set up your camera settings. Before I actually set my camera to set up to take the photos, I need to get focus. And in the pitch darkness, you do not want to be relying on autofocus because it's just not going to function well. So what you're going to want to do is take a few test shots. To do this, all you have to do is set your camera actually to the max ISO it can go. It's kind of fun because not often do you actually set your camera to the insane settings, but I have my A7R III here set to 100,000 ISO. And then the next thing we're going to want to do is just rock our shutter to whatever works. I'm going to have it set to 1/5000th in an aperture of 2.8. And I'm just going to pull focus on the nearest star that I can see. This will allow me to get sharp images and get a few test shots to see kind of what a good photo would look like before I actually take the photo that's going to be my final image. After I get focus though, I'll put my settings back to something more reasonable. Usually I like to shoot below an ISO of 6400 as much as I can with my camera. This is just because anytime with most cameras you creep higher than that, you end up getting grainier images. However, we're just going to wait here until the conditions get a little bit more ideal. Usually a couple hours after sunset, the sky starts to get dark enough where the photos really bring out the stars. So I'll talk to you again once it's done. Okay, so it's later now and we're at the same spot. I have adjusted my composition. So unfortunately, while on location, my microphone's battery ended up dying. So the internal microphone switched on and the audio just is kind of unusable from this last bit of footage here. And it's just all wind. So I'm gonna go over what I talked about then now as I edit the image. So here's probably the best image I got from that night. It's not the best photo I've ever taken. I unfortunately didn't get a foreground exposure. Normally while you're taking images of the stars, a handy thing to do is to take two images, one for the sky and then a separate one with a much longer exposure to expose the foreground so that you can actually have some detail in the foreground. But I was remiss and forgot to do that. But as far as settings goes, I used an ISO of 8000, an aperture of f2.8, which is as fast as my 18mm lens can go, as well as a exposure time of 15 seconds. On the A7R III, you can see here that there still is a bit of star trails going on here in the image, and that makes sense because it is a 42 megapixel sensor. And in the top left corner, you can see there is a teeny bit of comma, which is when you have a little bit of longitudinal aberration in the stars. It results from imperfections in the camera lens. My Zeiss Batis is quite good in having very minimal coma, and it's only really noticeable in the extreme edges of the image, and even then, it's being nitpicky. However, it does exist in the image. But as far as the image goes, this is the exact exposure that I usually go for. You can see just a hint of the Milky Way. However, if I just even tweak the image slightly, it really will start to pop. So the first thing I like to do usually is just raise my exposure a bit, and that will just bump it up just to a point where I can start to see it. And then I'm going to crank the clarity and the dehaze. This is going to immediately make my image a whole heck of a lot more exciting. And you can see that there's a lot of potential here to work with, and we even got some reflections from in the water. So the next thing I like to do is pull up my blacks a teeny little bit on my tone curve and pull down my highlights. The reason I do this is to flatten the image a little bit. This is because across different devices such as phones, monitors, tablets, whatever people are looking at the picture on, or even if you're printing it, not all printers and displays have the same color range, so when I limit it just a little bit, it'll make the viewing experience much more consistent and allow me to edit it in a way that is going to be a little bit less exciting and probably have lower dynamic range than I could have, but also increase the consistency of how people see it. The next thing I'm going to do is add a bit of contrast in the tone curve. This is just going to kind of compensate for my flattening of the image a little bit. And then I'm going to just play around with these sliders just to bring out the details that I want. I can see there's some nice details in the cliff behind all that noise. And I'll bring down my highlights a bit, bring up my whites. And really, I'm not going to dive too far into what I like to do for the rest of the image, such as all my HCL sliders and everything there. I've already actually edited this image and I'll switch over to that. The last thing I'll touch on is the noise reduction. A big thing when taking images like this is you can see there's a lot of noise here. And I can get rid of that noise with noise reduction quite easily. But the thing is, when you're doing that, you're softening the image a ton. You can see there that those cliffs lost a ton of detail when I'm using this noise reduction, which is a shame because, again, I could have taken a separate image of the foreground and stacked it. However, I didn't do that here. And the huge thing is when you look at the sky here, you'll see that it just loses a whole lot of that clarity that you got with all those stars, because often Lightroom interprets star data as noise. So you end up losing a lot and you end up just getting a lot more muddy of an image. So it's a lot of pick and choose. You could get a little bit of a cleaner image with a lower ISO. However, in your editing process, you have to increase the noise reduction if you start to raise your exposure. So it depends on the camera you're using, the software and such. However, I like to just have my noise reduction around 25 usually, just to get rid of some of the obstructive noise, but still maintain the stars in the sky. The last big tip that I use is that I like to use an adjustment brush. You can use a gradiated filter, however, a brush works quite fine. And I have this preset already made called my Milky Way popper. All this does is increase some dehaze, increase the warmth, and increase the exposure a bit in an area that I want to. So I'm just going to go over where the Milky Way is in this photo, and I'm going to gently brush over it with this brush. And you're going to see it just increases the exposure and the contrast in this area of the image, adding a lot more dynamic range to that area. And you can see how dramatic of a difference it makes. It really brings out the Milky Way a ton, and it really doesn't really do that much. So it's kind of nice for situations where you might want to salvage what might be muddied in the image a little bit. But I'll skip on over to how I finally edited the image. This is the final version of it that I got, but this is a little bit more aggressive than I usually go with my edits. But you can see here that you got so much detail in those stars from a relatively quickly taken photo. However, I'm going to skip over to how you turn this image, well, if you were to take a sequence of these images and put it into a time lapse. So say I wanted to make a time lapse of the sky, all you need to do is you just switch your camera into the time lapse mode as I covered in the time lapse video, and you just get started from there. The thing to keep in mind is when you're doing astrophotography like this, it takes a lot longer than a regular time lapse. Like, each photo is 15 seconds, so imagine you do that for 240 photos. You can be out there for up to 3 hours. So a time lapse isn't something you kind of want to just jump into randomly. You have to plan, you have to bring warm clothes, you gotta expect to be out there for quite a while. But say you get the images, and imagine I had a whole bunch of them here. I'm just going to export them as a sequence, and then I'm going to open up a different program. It's called StarStax. StarStax is a free software, which I'll include a link to in the description, that's available for both Mac and PC, and it's an incredibly awesome software. So all you simply need to do is choose some photos you want to import. I'm going to choose some photos from a previous trip that I did that I already have rendered out and edited, and pull them into the software. Once you pull them into the software, it's very simple. All you need to do is open up your settings on the right-hand side here and decide what you want to do with the image. So you can choose to have a dark image. However, I didn't do that because the image is already quite clean on its own. But there's a few different modes you can use. You can use lighten or gap filling, which is my favorite. And basically all this will do is if I were to hit render now, we'll turn the image into a giant spiral where you see those like one star in the middle and the stars spiraling all around them. However, if I want to do a time lapse, all I need to do is put it onto comet mode. In comet mode, what it's going to do is add trails to the stars. And then all you have to do is hit save after each step, and you can save it to a certain location. And what this will do, it will start rendering the images, but each time it renders a new image going down, it will save a copy of that render. That way, by the time you're done, you'll have 240 images again, but now with the star trails that you want. So you can see I already did that here, and then I have a whole folder here full of the images that were outputted from the software. And if I go through them, we can see that they start to have the star trails that you're looking for, which is awesome because all you need to do is take these images, pull them into Adobe Premiere or your preferred software to make time lapses, and you're off to the races. I'm not going to dive into how to make a time lapse in Premiere because I already covered that in my time lapse video, which for I don't know how many times I mentioned it now, I covered in the previous video, but it's quite easy to do so, and I recommend checking that video out just for the full process. However, the big tips that I have for when you're making a time lapse of the stars is that you want to keep in mind less is sometimes more. When you're editing the images of the stars, you can see in this one, I had a lot of stars in the sky. And unfortunately, it actually turns out that it looks kind of busy. You lose track of all the stars and it ends up looking like it's just one homogeneous white sky. And an easy thing to do is actually to kind of reduce the tolerances in the StarStax software so that when it's choosing what it thinks is a star or how long the star trails are, it will be a little bit less sensitive and will be a little more selective in which stars it wants to add the trails to. This is going to result in you having a more pleasing final product, and it means that if your sky wasn't necessarily the best on the night of, where you couldn't get the best single image, say it was a night like the night that I took over here, you can actually salvage a lot of the images by turning them into a time lapse because it'll add a lot more interest to the time lapse while covering up the fact that the sky wasn't absolutely ideal. Well, as usual, it seems that was another really long video, and thank you for making it through the whole thing. I really appreciate you guys watching, and I really love making these videos. I'm sure you can tell photography is something I'm really passionate about, and I like being able to share that with others. So thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below. If you have any corrections to anything I said, I'm not perfect and I often flub my words. I try and catch that, but if I didn't, please feel free to let me know and I'll try and add corrections. But thank you very much for watching again, and I hope you have a very awesome day. See you in the next one.